My name is Rita Phillips. I'm just asking a question, I think it's to Paul, in regard to termination of pregnancies. Maybe I misinterpreted it, but when you said about having a diagnosis that the child may have a congenital problem, whether you'd have that choice to terminate the pregnancy. I personally don't think it's connected to Germany and their thoughts. It is because it's often the parents who have to live with that problem years later that have to be taken into consideration, and if they want to have more children, by having one disabled child may stop them from having more children. And it's not a religious belief, it's just that they're my views, and I find that a difficult thing to what you have just said.
Sorry, you misunderstood me. I wasn't in any way arguing against a woman's right to abortion, which I vigorously and strongly and unconditionally support. What I was referring to is a certain body of work within contemporary bioethics, according to which some people from Australia, from our local context, argue that a woman, what I said was a woman carrying a baby with Down syndrome had an obligation to undergo an abortion, which in some circumstances, according to this argument, should even be enforced by law. Under these circumstances, it's like the reverse of what you're saying, that it's not the woman's choice. On the contrary, it's a society's judgment that certain babies or children or fetuses or whatever are without value and so therefore should be able to be put to death. That's unrelated to the question of whether women should have the right to avail themselves of the possibility of abortion, which I strongly support, as I said.
Okay, another question. Yes, at the back, Greg.
Greg Goodman. I'm interested in the group's, there's not any particular person, view of personalising the example of a person who may almost exemplify an issue. So I'm thinking of what Khashoggi, for example, the journalist who was murdered, has done, where nobody could actually make a difference in Yemen and Saudi Arabia and Iran fighting a proxy war, and suddenly one person's intervention, one person's death has made the community understand in a contextual way the problems that countries like Saudi Arabia have. And in looking at that, I'm thinking maybe people have the issues of fear and ignorance and maybe just total disinterest in the things that we've been talking about in general, until an example, a humanised example, makes them think about and contextualising and individualising the situation to understand it. And in that terms, I'm thinking of the refugee situation, obviously, as a prime example of that, of humanising through example rather than humanising through discussion. Just interested in the people's opinion.
You want to comment first and then pass it along?
Because I've got the mic.
Power in the mic.
The Khashoggi case is obviously complicated. Khashoggi himself was no saint, and we will have to wait and see whether it actually makes any difference in Saudi Arabia. But nonetheless, you're talking about the mechanisms of change, and that's really important, an important thing to think about. So the mechanisms of change and the dynamics of change, including, as we were talking in the first session, about the importance of civil society, organisations and the public agencies and so on, that's one thing. The other question, though, is the broader context within which these problems arise and trying to understand their structural determinants. And I guess in the second session that we just finished, you heard two different approaches. I'm proposing some deep structural and political forces or factors that make possible these sorts of abominations, whereas Paul and Ida and others referred to the psychological preconditions and structures that might contribute to them. And I guess both of them might be important. But I guess my point is, to be able to change things, you've got to understand what it is that causes them and what perpetuates their existence.
Do I need to press anything? Thanks for giving me the mic. As humans, we only can empathise with a few other humans. And I think we can empathise with Anne Frank, but we can't empathise with 6 million people. And I think these stories are important because they do highlight what is going on more generally. But yeah, maybe we do need to have a concept of all levels of society, from individual to humanity. But the real feeling part, I think, we have been structured so as to relate to individuals and individual stories. That's what we relate to.
Anyone else? Perhaps if I could comment, Greg, far be it from me to deal with philosophical issues, but some years ago I was compelled to read Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and in that book he talks about the need, before change occurs, he's referring predominantly to science and medicine, you need a crisis. You need an event which creates a crisis. And following that crisis, there is often change or revolution. Now, maybe we are experiencing that crisis right now in relation to the treatment of children on Manus, and perhaps that's the sort of trigger for change. In the same way that maybe Nelson Mandela was a trigger for change. There was crisis, and it's gone on for a very long time. So it's the individual who highlights the crisis, or the small group of individuals that may bring about more change than a whole political, social process.
Well, I've got the mic, so I'll use it. Yeah, look, I totally agree, and I wonder myself whether the government is taking silently children off Nauru because they are actually scared that a child will die, because they've been definitely warned that a child might soon die. If that happens, that child can be a symbol that the government doesn't really want.
And
Leon?
sorry.
Yes. Dr. Tracy, my question is addressed to you. As a retired teacher of nearly 50 years, starting in the States and the last 30 years here, I've seen a tremendous change. In the early 70s when I began, there was not one student with a disability in the school, let alone in my classroom. And over the years, and particularly probably in the last 10 or 15 years, where integration has been a big part, I know I've been changed. I am such a more informed person and open to more teaching methods. And I see the effect that it has on students when there are kids with disabilities in the classroom. But I don't think we're doing enough. What would you suggest, or where do we need to go?
I totally agree with you. I think, I really think we should get rid of special schools and include everybody into schools, because the learning outcomes for kids with disability are no worse in general schools, and the lessons learned about diversity and the value of difference, a human lesson to the other children, to everybody in that school, is so powerful that that's the way that we need to change, because that then brings that whole generation up, understanding and not being fearful of difference.
And recognizing that the person in a wheelchair or the person who's visually impaired is a person.
That's right.
Not a wheelchair.
And a wheelchair is just, my daughter took my son's wheelchair to Kinder for show and tell, so it just dispels those myths. It's just a way of getting around, the person is using a tool just like we all use tools for various things in our lives. And I think inclusion in education is a really, really important way of changing our future society, but it's not quick enough. It's certainly a part, but we have to address the now as well. So thank you for that question. That's really important to me.
Anne?
Oh, this is just a quick question for Paul. In your talk, you referred to was it an academic or a philosopher? What was his name? I just wanted to... How do you spell it?
Agamben.
Thank you.
So obviously everyone here is in favour of inclusion, but social inclusion can act as a two-edged sword, and one has to be careful. If one means by inclusion respect for diversity and plurality, that's a good thing. If one means by inclusion incorporation into a larger undifferentiated totality where everyone fulfills the same conditions for work and rationality, then it has exactly the opposite effect. So inclusiveness can be used in a very pernicious way as well as in a progressive way.
So you need the microphone.
About autistic children. You know, you've probably seen on the news how they put tied up in a cage because teachers can't manage them and they're unruly. And I have friends, they have a son, and it's very unfortunate. They're unable to attend the school.
I think the question's about managing autism in autistic children who
yes, so some children are find it much harder to join a classroom community and learn in the same way that other children do, but they can learn things at their rate. Well, although I don't think we should have special schools, I think we should have special education. We need the expertise to address the individual needs of students. And I totally agree with Paul that we need equity, not equality. So we need equity so everybody has the same opportunity to learn and to develop to different rates. My son can count to 3. That's as far as he gets. But, you know, so academically, that's as far as he reached. But all through his school, he had the social lessons, he had the language lessons, he had the lessons about belonging to community that were just as important as numeracy.
Rosalie, you got the mic?
Just a very quick question directed at Jane or anybody else who, anybody else who wishes to respond. In this room, we have a lot of people at the back, Greg, up the front, a number of health professionals. And, you know, this is a bit of a Dorothy Dixon, but it's not really. Leaders in terms of the way in which society values health professionals and the expectation, whether it's always met or not, is that they operate in an ethical manner and consider these sorts of issues in their practice. What are the ways in which you've had to contend with translating the ideas that you have in teaching medical students or other students within the domain? What are the challenges? What are the challenges in training them to understand what we've been talking about today?
The medical students, often the young students, when we talk about one of the principles of care of people with intellectual disability is to always think, how would I treat this person with a disability if they didn't have a disability? And then, am I going to change my approach? And if so, why? Students find that just logical, just common sense. So they are coming with a more a sense of us all being the same, a sense of being able to focus on similarities, not on differences, more than previous generations, I think. But it's not until they get into practice and they get to the nitty-gritty and the hard stuff that some of these issues really come up and need to be addressed on an individual basis. And the best learning for doctors is always through their own patients, because that's what really resonates, and it comes back to the stories that you raised before, Greg, about the importance of story. And doctors know their own patients and can see and learn through their own patients in a powerful way. And we always bring, part of our teaching is to bring the voice of people with disabilities into the classroom, into the learning environment, through the use usually of audio visuals, because that's just from a logistic, practical point of view easier. But we also employ people with disabilities as tutors for our medical students, so that they meet people with disability in that role of a valued teacher for particular aspects of their course. So, yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to hog the discussion, but one shouldn't idealise the medical profession. Doctors are a reflection of their society, and no doubt all the medical practitioners here do the right thing. But we should remember, I mean, you don't only have to go and look at the exhibition behind. The Nazi horrors were part of a normalised practice of a distorted society, and part of that normalisation was actually carried out by the medical practitioners. So Nazi medicine was highly normalised in the service of the Nazi values, if you can call it that, or lack of them. And the same applies here. Doctors are agents of the society. They're the authorities that enforce social control, just as they are practitioners of ethics.
That's why I asked the question.
Yes.
Paul, I agree with what you just said there about idealising doctors, and I just wanted to make a point about the lady over here asking about children with autism. And I apologise, these are both comments rather than questions, never give me a microphone. Our government recently proposed diverting funding for the NDIS towards farmers in drought, and if that is not testimony to the value that they place on the needs of people with disabilities in this country, then I don't know what is. The funding of early interventions for children with autism is critical to them being able to integrate into society and be able to thrive. So that's one area where I think we need to really call out how our government are behaving. The other thing I was going to say around the education of medical students, I'm currently involved in teaching clinical and research ethics to medical students. And one of the things that troubles me is the fact that as a component of learning for both doctors, and I'm certain within nursing as well, which is my background, it only comprises a very small part of medical education. Doctors need extensive medical training to do the work that they do, but the time that is actually spent on teaching the decision-making and the ability to communicate and learn about ethical decision-making is really a fraction of the time that doctors get, and I don't think adequately equips people to go out there into the world and really think about these problems. So I think that's something that needs to be addressed.
Okay, another question? Hannah? Yeah, I think...
Just a quick pointer, and it follows the discussion. Sort of 2-minute medicine, so doctors may have a will to engage with the stories of their patients, but the whole system disenables that, and it's in and out, and no time for this sort of engagement. And often, having done some research in this area, issues that are complicated require a psychological engagement. You might have two parts of the practice, and the practice that engages in a deeper way are often not bringing in the money, and then are not seen to be servicing the financial needs of the practice. And often it's women doctors dealing with domestic violence are usually seen as culprits and not pulling their weight in terms of the practice. So what is the purpose of that medical practice?
I guess it's an example. Can I
yes, go ahead.
An example of where you need different levels, addressing different levels to solve an issue. So to provide doctors with the opportunity to learn about their patients and hear their story, and to treat them in the multidisciplinary way that needs to be part of a multidisciplinary approach to care. There are Medicare item numbers that enable more time to be spent and for subsidised multidisciplinary care. Trouble is, a lot of GPs don't know about them, so then you come back to that education of medical students is one thing, but it's only a small part of their educational journey, and we need to have that continual medical education, because we're all ready for different information at different times in our lives, and we need to keep on providing relevant information. And when people go into practice, information about the MBS item numbers that are relevant is a very important step to enable people to engage in a more meaningful way with their patients.
Natalie, I think this will be the last question, and don't forget that Ida is suffering from question deficiency syndrome here.
Sorry, Ida, it's actually for Jane, because the comment she was making around special schools. And I'm sorry, I forgot the woman's name who asked the question when you were talking about that you saw very few people with disability in mainstream schools in the 70s. Sorry,
yeah.
Catherine. I went to a special school, and when somebody at work found that out the other day, they said, "No, you didn't." I said, "Yes, I did," because up until about 1977, it was generally assumed that anybody with any disability went to special schools. And up until 1973, I've read the Act, you had to get permission from a minister to leave a special school to go in a so-called mainstream school. And I went to 2 special schools because that's what you did if you were born in the 1960s. And I went to Uralla Baldwin, which doesn't exist, and I went to Marathon, which also doesn't exist. And as my mother told me, the reason I left the special school to come to the school that I ended up doing most of my education was because the principal walked in, called my mother in one day and said, "Natalie's smart." I thought all the other kids in my class were smart. They seemed to be smart to me. Didn't seem to have a problem. "We can't teach her separately." Yeah. So I was about 10. So they started looking for a school for me, and given its due, Beth Rivka came up. It took them a while, and but they agreed to take me. There were no lifts. I had just learnt to climb stairs. I could go to the toilet myself, so the physios figured, well, she's had some basic physio. We've taught her to climb stairs. We can't do any more, so we might as well see how this goes. And it took a year for Beth Rivka to decide to do it, and it took me probably 4 years at school before I was kind of accepted. I knew I was accepted because in term 3, in year 9, what was then form 3, I got elected class captain. It took 4 years. Now all of those girls are my friends. I don't blame them, but there was no education. All of the stuff that we hear about now, bullying, all of those things happened. Now, I think they would have happened anyway, but I was an easier target because I was the only kid in that school who had a disability. And I also came in with my mother. My mother couldn't afford to pay, so I came in with a fee-paying school as a non-fee-paying kid. So you can imagine the pressure. Don't muck up. Because if you muck up, they will throw you out, and then what am I going to do? So, and you know, to its credit, it's had kids ever since. I'm not talking about Beth Rivka necessarily as different from anyone else, but it just shows you it's a timing thing. It's also a matter of attitude, because nobody would think of putting me in a special school now. They would have all the supports there. But I actually agree with you. I don't think we should have special schools. And some people come out to me in horror and they'll give you all the examples as to all the people who, they couldn't possibly, X person couldn't possibly cope in a mainstream school, but they weren't sure if I could either. And yes, you need special education, because I don't actually think there should be special education. I think anybody who teaches should be a special educator and a mainstream educator. There shouldn't be a designation because they're all kids.
With what Natalie was saying, I totally agree, because I used to look after an autistic boy, And when he first went to kindy, they said, okay, so you're autistic, we know how to deal with autistic kids. So they put him in this kindy and they did it like they would every other autistic kid, but they didn't think that he had ADHD and panic attacks as well. So their way of teaching actually disrupted him really badly, and he ended up having to stay home for at least 2 years with only his mum looking after him, because the way they said, look at this picture, show us the picture and you can have your sandwich. Well, he didn't understand that. And so, like you say, it can work both ways. You can try and teach them the way you think all of them are meant to be taught, but it doesn't work.
I think you'll agree that we've had a very comprehensive and far-reaching discussion around the theme of Holocaust and disability. And I'd like to call on Dr. Alan Schaefer for some comments by way of conclusion and winding things up. Thank you, Alan.
Thanks very much. I better get in quick as I see people starting to drift out of the door, and it's so difficult to comment on so many complex and valuable contributions. But I want to start with a quite provocative one. I was looking now at the title, The Legacy of the Nazi Persecution of People with Disabilities, and thinking about the fact that Natalie was the almost last speaker from the floor. And I was struck by something that occurred here today that I thought was a remarkable experience in this workshop, which I think has been delivered with absolute integrity, and I'm very grateful to the organisers. I was very struck by the fact that one of the disabled speakers couldn't get onto the platform. And I thought, what does that tell us about, even in a group like this, that we can make someone invisible in this way? Now, that's not a criticism of anyone at all. It's rather a statement that draws our own culpability into what happens in our societies. And I want to say a bit more, drawing from that example. I mentioned to you that I'd been involved in these immersive experiences exploring the dynamics of the impact of the Holocaust and other issues in Europe. And what these experiences have brought to my attention, as well as 40 years of working with people's unconscious lives, is the way the unconscious operates in society. Now, by the unconscious, we can think of it, as I've alluded to today, simply as that which is outside of our awareness, but nevertheless has a huge impact on how we conduct ourselves individually and collectively. And I think one of the dimensions that's very difficult for us to face is our two particular areas: our own flawedness and our own destructiveness. And I think the consequence of this links with some of the comments that were made by many of the speakers earlier. Why do certain people get picked out as the objects of prejudice or the objects of annihilation or made invisible? And a number of those kinds of people were mentioned: disabled people, homosexuals, Jews, many other groups of people who are other. That's a very familiar term. And I think part of what we need to understand is that it's very easy in a social context for us to be drawn into not recognizing in the other what is in ourselves. Now, some years ago, it must have been 15 years ago, I was an invited speaker for the B'nai B'rith Anti-Discrimination Commission, where I gave a talk which I titled, "Hate Your Neighbour as You Hate Yourself," which people were shocked by initially. Of course, it was a play on the biblical statement about loving your neighbour, but I wanted to draw people's attention to the fact that we need to find what it is in ourselves that we can't bear, and as a result, more easily locate it in others who have some flaw or some characteristic which we determine to be a flaw, and how, in the social context, this occurs in an exponential way outside of our awareness. I'm very aware that one name hasn't been mentioned today, so I'm going to mention it because I think we see this happening dramatically, not only in Australia, but in Trump's America, where one sees this happening over and over again in a very powerful and disturbing social way. So, whilst I am completely committed to and believe in a civil society what we have to face is the uncivility in ourselves. And unless we actually can face the uncivility in ourselves and contain it and manage it, both individually and collectively, we're going to have an ongoing struggle, really, to maintain that civility at a more conscious level. I think one word which came through very often today that really struck me and which I would like to repeat and emphasize is the notion of vigilance. I think that it is so easy for us to lose sight of those things even which we value, just as would happen today, unless we remain vigilant. And it's a very difficult thing to remain vigilant because the hurly-burly of everyday life draws our attention on our own personal difficulties and on the challenges of living in a highly complex and very fast society today. But I think this is crucial. Not only do we have to remain vigilant, for example, to the kind of abominations perpetrated by our governments, but I think I've come across far too many people who describe themselves as not being an activist. And by not being an activist, you are an active participant in the perpetration of many of the things which today we have heard about. So that I think part of that, and I think this addresses the issue of how people are dehumanized, how people are made invisible, and how that easily then becomes a source of attack on them. For example, put people on an island far away, and we don't know anything about their personal stories unless we have an opportunity to experience them. And it's very easy to get caught up in that kind of what I call primitive process. So we have to remain vigilant, and we also have to remain engaged. I think not the only way, but a key way, and I think it's emerged through a number of the things people have said today, a key way in which we can oppose the dehumanization of other. And of course, there are many others in our society. We are actually all other in one way or another, is through engagement, through finding a way of connecting with the other rather than participating in the divisiveness, the splitting, and the distancing of the other. Distancing, dehumanizing, creation of stereotypes, names which give whole groups identities as if there are no individuals in them, are very powerful forces which those who seek power are able to utilize. So we have to, I think, remain very vigilant and take whatever opportunities we can. One of the personal endeavors that I've been committed to, I'll just make this point very briefly because I know we're almost out of time, is as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, I've been aware that the history of psychoanalysis, despite its enormous contribution to our understanding our civilization, has focused its attention inside the consulting room and remained there very, very often. And increasingly now, in fact, I came just the other day across a new committee established by the International Psychoanalytic Association, which is specifically about engaging with community organizations that deal with refugees and a whole list of others. So I think it's so important to, in our professional roles also, to find ways of engaging. But I think the most important point that I want to just reiterate, and I'm very grateful to the speakers who I have enormous respect for today, and particularly to the organisers, who I think have done an extremely important service to our community in holding the seminar, is that we individually and collectively, as I've said already, have to pay close attention to those parts of ourselves, those flaws which we find difficult to bear in ourselves, and which can so easily find in the other, who we can then persecute. And where those in power, such as Hitler and other very powerful figures, can exploit very powerfully in the perpetration and the perpetuation of the kind of experience that the Holocaust saw. And we say, lest we forget, I think that we have to be vigilant because we are in the midst of many of similar processes now. At least they're emergent. So I thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope I've made some helpful comments.